I think we're going live now.
Okay, great. We are live. Okay. Roger, you there? Okay, from live from the Shabazz Center. Thank you. Okay. Good evening. Good evening. We're live here. Hope you are too, and also safe and secure in this time of the pandemic, COVID-19. I mean, the situation is just absolutely perilous globally. But we're here at the Malcolm X, Dr. Betty Shabazz Memorial and Education Center. And it's been 56 years. It's amazing the time that's gone by when El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz was taken from us so absolutely brutally. It was a Sunday afternoon, too. What a moment that was, unforgettable tragedy for us. But we draw inspiration from his life and his legacy. I mean, over the last several days, there's been so much activity. This is Black History Month. And we've had so many events. Even as we join you this evening, there are events going on. I just left the television, TNT had Malcolm X on television. You look around the events that are going on. Baba, you had an event with Zach Kondo, and I guess he's off with Peter Bailey right now. Malcolm's presence is everlasting, ever constant. And this evening, what we want to do is kind of reflect on his inspiration, his influence on our activism, on our intellectual, political consciousness. And I can say personally, from that standpoint, I've been moved by his presence. Oh my goodness. I'm 82 years old. So I go back to Malcolm when I was 19, 20 in Detroit, and then later in New York. When I was in the military, I was stationed in Germany. I had no idea he was traveling through Germany at that point. Landed at Frankfurt Airport. Yasa and I, we've talked about that before. On his way to do the Hajj, on his way to the Middle East, on his way to North Africa, on his way to history and destiny, on his way to meet, as a kind of an ambassador, minister, without portfolio, traveling, representing Black America in particular, and meeting with all of these renowned world leaders. This is just absolutely incredible. That he was doing it so long too. He was not traveling with any kind of entourage, a lot of front people, aides, assistants, people preparing talking points for him, anything like that. He had to do all this on his own. And he did it remarkably well. Ilyasa and I captured a bit of that in his diary, following him from meeting to meeting, session to session, world leader to world leader, traveling across all those different countries. But more than anything, his presence in this country. You can talk about Africa, we can talk about the Caribbean, the West Indies, we can talk about Europe, Asia, but it was here in the US, from Omaha to the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. 39 eventful years. I was listening to Dr. James Smalls last night. Baba, he was recounting his experiences with Malcolm, taking over the Muslim Mosque Incorporated after his assassination, talking about all these individuals who was in and out of Malcolm's presence. Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, Dr. Ben, all of those here courageous women who were part of the OAAU. Those are remarkable times, remarkable moments, unforgettable. Anyway, I want to stop at this point and bring my colleagues in. I don't know how to do this. I think, Ilyasa, you should come on up and say something to the audience before we move into any kind of panel discussion. You got to set a tone and mood for us that you can do so exceptionally well. Okay? Assalamu alaikum.
She's muted.
Are you there, Ilyasa? I'm not hearing you.
Is the program, has it begun?
Uh-oh. Perhaps she wasn't ready.
I am ready. I'm more than.
Oh, yeah, here she is.
Okay, today we honor the life and legacy of my father, Malcolm X, who was assassinated 56 years ago at the Audubon Ballroom. It was the grassroots community, along with my mother, Dr. Betty Shabazz, who fought to preserve the sacred space that is now known as the Shabazz Center. As we know, Brother Malcolm's home was firebombed on the evening of February 14th while sleeping with his wife and young babies. 1 week later, my mother would witness the assassination of her husband at the Audubon Ballroom. I imagine she walked into the space with her 4 babies and pregnant with my youngest sisters, the twins, and she walked out devastated by the terror we as a family witnessed. My mother, however, subscribed to the phrase passed down from her mother, find the good and praise it. My mother has held celebrations of life for the legacy of her husband for as long as I can remember. And our family, my 5 sisters and I, have continued with these annual commemorations. Dr. Betty Shabazz safeguarded his legacy from the false depictions portrayed of him. She did so not so that her husband could be illuminated, but for the benefit of future generations. Over the past 20 years, the Shabazz Center has been referred to as the house that Betty built. And if we could take just 30 seconds in a moment of silence for our many slain leaders, for Betty and her soldier, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, we would be very much appreciative. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-chairperson, Julio Peterson, our outstanding and committed board, our Director of Institutional Advancement, Ms. Naja Zigby Johnson, and this illustrious panel that we have assembled here for you, actually that Naja assembled for us this evening. It is my hope that today's conversation will inspire us of Brother Malcolm's exemplary and unwavering commitment to our collective liberation. This discussion is also a call to action with a clarified sense of how and what we must do to build power and relationships grounded in our flourishing and freedom. While most remember Brother Malcolm as a fearless African-American Muslim leader and advocate of international Afro-diasporic unity, today we will be focusing on Malcolm's Confederation, the organization of Afro-American unity that he addressed at the Audubon Ballroom in June of 1964. The OAAU was a Pan-Africanist organization committed to international Black sovereignty and the realization of human rights in the face of global white supremacy. And just 8 months after its founding, Malcolm was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom. And it gives me such pleasure and such an honor to introduce to you this unforgettable panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasa. Always very, very moving, heartfelt moments for you and the family. Of course, you've been so absolutely tireless out there over the years. What book are you working on now? I know you're working on, I saw you had a couple of fresh books out there digging into your father's, there you go, The Awakening of Malcolm X. That's just wonderful. That's available, Ilyasa, now? Mm-hmm.
It is.
Very good. Well, I know you talk about this here distinguished panel here. Heaven only knows where you start. I can just do the roulette wheel. Boom, wherever it stops, it's good. Baba, since I was with you most recently, and you were just such a splendid moderator and conductor of affairs last night, you got some fresh things on your mind. You know, you had a little rehearsal. So go ahead and talk to us a little bit about your connection to what Ilyasa is talking about in terms of going back to the founding of the OAAU, which of course grew out of the OAU. And of course, you can talk about that too, Baba. Go ahead.
First, let me say how humbled and honored I am just to be here and to share in this way. And this is a distinguished panel, and it's a very heavy moment where our entire people were traumatized in a way that we should never forget. And as we heal in pursuit of our liberation, right? He never gave up. Our ancestors who endured centuries of bondage never gave up. And under no circumstances, standing on their shoulders, should we give up. So I you know, I'm trying to contain my emotions because I get quite emotional on this day, and certainly in settings like this. I want to say, Ilyasa, how proud I am of you, right? Your output and your dignity, your energy, your healthiness. There's so much, you know, like your father, and I know your parents are extremely proud of you as we are, right? These young heads coming behind me on this panel all represent something very, very special on this walk. Robin, right? Your scholarship on Black women in struggle, particularly on the party, is something hugely personal to me. I was raised by Panther women, incredible Panther women, including Rosemary Mealy, Janet Cyril, Safi Bukhari, and of course our beloved Sada Shakur, who was in exile, right? I'm supremely proud to be touched on them. I'm also very excited about this book that has come out on Ilyasa's grandmother, See, and as a culture worker, I have to frame it in this way. We are a matrilineal people. And one thing that I want to certainly share about Malcolm that's very important to appreciate in this moment, he had belonged to several important streams of struggle with his own unique heroism. First, he was as a thinker, he belongs into that special place of the great Black radical tradition. And the Black radical tradition, as I'm looking at it, we are not going to confine ourselves to the Eurocentric Marxist-Leninist paradigm, right? Our radical tradition goes back to those ancestors who didn't just rise up against slavery, but rose up against it with clear ideas about how they wanted to govern and be self-determining as they did so. Now, particularly, we'll shout out the Haitian Revolution, who gave us the birth of modern Pan-Africanism with their victory, right? That's the wellspring from which we have to appreciate this particular ancestor, right? We have to appreciate him as Gil Noble rightfully appreciated him in his legendary film that he did spotlighting Ilyas's Uncle Wilfred, right? Right? The loss of our warrior that captures Malcolm, the organizer. He was a quintessential organizer. When he came out of that prison in Detroit, came into Detroit, rolling with his brothers back in 1952, there are only about a handful of viable chapters or mosques in the Nation of Islam. But when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad cut him loose and he got busy, when he left, there were more than 36 more based on his organizing, his singular organizing, using that formula, expanding that formula beyond the imagination and the limitations of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I must say also. And we need to be very clear about that. And finally, he was not finally, he was also belongs to the canon of the Black radical journalist tradition. Son of Louise Langdon Norton Little, who had them reading from the Negro World newspaper at their tables as children. He founded Muhammad Speaks. He put Muhammad Speaks in the street and made Muhammad Speaks one of the most quintessential tools of journalistic liberation that we have in the modern. That belongs to Malcolm. And he needs to be honored and appreciated as that. And then, of course, his global piece, the global dimensions of what he did, bringing us to the realm of Pan-Africanism and embracing also and synthesizing the modern expression of the Black radical tradition. When you stand on the shoulders of a Paul Robeson, as he studied Robeson copiously, even from inside prison, right? It was Robeson who led that charge to the United Nations before Malcolm's charge that would come later on, right? That is an embrace also of the modern construct of the radical tradition on top of our long vision of that radical tradition. So I want to definitely make those particular points. And then also let's come to the persona of the man. He was sincere. He was pure, man of a pure heart and a pure soul, right? And he was disciplined in his personal life, disciplined in his public organizing life. And while our children and our grandchildren gave us an epic hot summer of 2020, I would say to them, to the men and women, and I'm particularly proud of this, so much of that was led by our daughters and our granddaughters, right? The feminine principle moving forward, right? And Malcolm was one of the first to show us how to do that, right? He was trying to bring in the notion of collective leadership based on his relationship with SNCC, who stood on the shoulders of Ella Baker, who gave that to them. It's a feminine principle, right? Engage, take care of everybody, takes care of each other, struggle, fight, heal, and keep moving forward. It's the feminine principle. He was ahead of his time in his embrace of that. So we need that discipline. We need that vision. The call for a united front on the question of our human rights is as important today as it ever was, even though we are in a different international construct. We're not in a bipolar Cold War era that he was in. You know, the United States government is still the empire of the world, and there are contradictions within the North over how those kind of things get down. But the South is rising on the principle of human solidarity. And I should also say that one of the things that we need to appreciate too is that when we started cities, saying that cities rise up in protest, from Boston all the way to Buenos Aires, right? Malcolm gave us a definition of what it is to be an African people in the Western Hemisphere, and the importance of us rallying around that under the banner of Pan-Africanism. That energy is starting to come forward, right? And those of us who claim to be inheritors of that mantle, we need to have ourselves ready to give our children and our grandchildren everything they need so they can go forward and, in Panther language, seize this time, right? And Herb, you mentioned yesterday, and I'm gonna wind up because I can go off, and I'm not, and I'm really trying not to. The international question is still hugely important. We had with us yesterday Nana Gyamfi from the National Conference of Black Lawyers, who just gave us a powerful international human rights tribunal on police violence in the United States against Afro-descendants in this, the 6th year of the decade, the international decade of African descent. And I would dare say between now and 2024, we should be building those coalitions as he was a great coalition builder, building that united front. So when we get to 2024, we are in a position to say to the world is not ready to give us the reparations that we do. You know, there's going to be some problems, right? But at the same time, in our building, we're going to take care of ourselves, we're going to heal ourselves, and we're going to continue to move forward and fight for the dignity that our children, our grandchildren, and our beautiful ones not yet born yet deserve. We ain't going nowhere. And we're going to move forward, and we're going to move forward on the dignity of his example, and we're going to do that by any means necessary. I'll stop there.
Whoa. Goodness, you know, self-determination is one of the words that resonate from your remarks. And always, my students heard you. Matter of fact, many of my students at City College, I'm hoping they're joining us. But once they checked you out, they hit me with, can you bring him to the class? I said, well, maybe so. Because go ahead. You have these powerful speakers coming in, and next thing you know, they reduce you, they diminish you. Oh, well, no. You know, I think that's going to happen, though. You know, even now they're enjoying your presentation, understanding the kind of unimpeachable integrity that Malcolm presented to the world. Robin, you ready for us, Robin? Dr. Spencer?
Yes, that was powerful. Thank you for starting us off in that way. I think you took me so many places. I want to just call out how many times I've entered the Shabazz Center, and how each time it's almost a different experience. And when I became a mother, and to go there and imagine the violence that unfolded in the face of Malcolm's family, made the loss like hit me in a whole other way. So I'm really, really pleased to be here. I'm honored to be in the presence of Ilyasa and all of you, just to share some reflections on Malcolm X as a people's historian. I think it's so important to think about all of the ways to keep Malcolm alive, that Malcolm is living with us. And one of the powerful things that always kind of comes to mind for me is just the importance and significance of his travel and his talks and the people in the audience, right? We may know some of those famous people. When he spoke, many well-known or budding Black Power activists were in the audience. In Detroit, General Baker, for example, future founder of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, somebody who, again, is oftentimes erased from our textbooks and our collective knowledge. But someone like him was in the audience for the ballot or the bullet speech. And when Malcolm said, "Who's ready to bleed?" he yelled out, "I'll bleed," right? And that was a memory for him, right? Just the ways that Malcolm in his travels impacted and influenced so many people and brought people together one of the things I'm looking at now is thinking through the people who were there at the moment of his martyrdom, the violence that took him from us. And people like Yuri Koshiyama, for example, and all that she meant, all of her history of struggle, and we'll hear from Akimi in a little bit. People like Sarah Wright, poet, activist, Harlemite, part of the Harlem Writers Guild, who brought a whole other cultural sensibility. We don't oftentimes connect Malcolm to that cultural sensibility, but he was an influence on people who were writing poems and who were creating art and just encouraging a different way of moving through the world and centering the arts. People like Robert Desvernay, card-carrying OAAU member who was in the audience, people like Pat Robinson, who founded organizations to help the family to get together and provide the material support that somebody would need in the wake of such an event. I think sometimes when we describe this, you know, the Malcolm X and the moments, we forget that he was just here, right? It wasn't like hundreds of years ago. He was just here, and he was a father, he was a husband. And in the wake of that loss, you know, people had to carry on. And one of the things that people like Pat Robinson did was to organize with others to provide material support for the family, emotional support as well. And there are many like that. If you look at people like Ruby Dee and Ozzie Davis, for example, so many layered connections and networks of support. I think Malcolm is so brilliant in revealing to us the networks that kept movements going. Sometimes it's because he's such a formidable figure, it's tempting to focus on him singularly, right? And separate him out or to pair him with other people, other great male leaders usually. When we look at Malcolm, he really represents a network, a deep-rooted connection to different currents of struggle within the Black community. So people like Queen Mother Moore, for example, people who were his mentors, the people that he influenced. It's an incredible set of Malcolm's children who went out into the world in the wake of his absence. And for the Panthers, right, they saw themselves as the heirs of Malcolm X, right? That's what they would oftentimes say, we are the heirs of Malcolm X. There's so many heirs of Malcolm X who went out into the Black Power moment in the late 1960s and tried to change the world for the better, not for their individual gain or for their protection, but to make the world better for so many. So that is the important thing, I think, to note about Malcolm X. And it's important, this began with Ilyasha holding up a children's book. It's important to teach Malcolm X to the children, right? Because oftentimes one can escape, you know, learning more about Malcolm X through official channels, right? Unless you may have a personal drive or interest or things like that. But to bring Malcolm X to children, to encourage people to learn more about him, engage his history, and engage the people around him as well, and the people that he influenced and the people that influenced him, that will keep the Black radical tradition alive and well and thriving in our communities. That is what we need. I think that every time we quote Malcolm X or think about Malcolm X, it's important to pair that with something else. Learn about somebody that you didn't know about, because Malcolm was not someone who sought that type of platform or pedestal or spotlight in that way, right? So it's important to think about him and his connections, his networks, I mean, especially the role that women played. And I think, you know, by becoming connected to places where he was, the Shabazz Center, even the streets of Harlem. Harlem is rich with Malcolm X's history, as is Detroit, as are so many parts of the country and the world. Tracing his steps would be really, really interesting. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to become people's historians and to ensure that Malcolm X history is not forgotten, right? There could be a Malcolm X tour of Harlem, a Malcolm X tour of the world. That's what somebody could be doing with their time, you know, in technology use, something that would help to sort of keep Malcolm's vision alive and to keep alive all that he represented. So I wanted to end there. Thank you.
No, you'll be back. I'm
I'll be
bringing you
back.
back. Wonderful. In terms of evoking the significance, the importance of the young, impressionable minds, what Ilyasa is doing with those books. That's the beginning. We build on that. You cited General Baker. I don't know, you got some Detroit history in you there, right? That's remarkable. But I remember the last time I was in your presence, you helped facilitate a conversation the audience had with Mumia Abu Jamal. That was a remarkable moment to have a chance to have Mumia speak to us from behind those walls. Lumumba,
Yes, indeed.
Mumia.
Peace,
Ah,
peace.
my
Good
goodness.
evening. Good evening. Good evening.
Good to be with you again.
It's good to be with you all as well. And thank you for going straight there and lifting up the name of Mumia. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the legacy of our brother Malcolm. We are clear that the legacy of the Panthers, the legacy of not just the Black radical tradition as defined by Baba Zaid, but our Black liberation movement in general, very specifically, comes out of that legacy. And I wanted to raise a few things to connect to where we are now. As was stated earlier, we are coming off of, and still in, if we're quite honest, the largest uprising in the history of this country. The New York Times stated last July, there were over 25 million people that participated in protests last year. This is not the Times is giving us that number. We know that there's more than that. And the conversation around what this actually means for our movement, for our people, for our communities is significant. For those of us who are very much close to the history of our liberation movement, there may be some questions around the current Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black Lives, et cetera. People have a lot of things that they're trying to figure out. And I want to clarify a few things. One, this particular movement that we are seeing right now absolutely is in the tradition and comes out of the vision and work of our Black Shining Prince. And for those of us who are looking to see how that connects, let us not look for aesthetics. Let's look at principles. Let's look at courage. Let's look at creativity. Let's look at strategy. Let's look at intentionality. Because when we look at those things, you will see that as it exists. And I invite you all to take a look at the vision for Black Lives that was created by the Movement for Black Lives. People are oftentimes not informed about what the strategy actually is, why people are organizing, why people are mobilizing. In the 49 years that I've been around organizing and mobilizing, I've yet to see a very comprehensive agenda like the one that was established that sits right now at the Movement for Black Lives. So I welcome and invite people to really look at that. The creativity that is exhibited by young people. People are finding ways to resist through technology, of course. We know that that's changed the game significantly, but people are finding ways to resist in ways that did not previously exist. So we're talking about young people on college campuses. We're talking about people who are using their arts and their creativity in different ways to reflect what it is we want to see happen. But then also there's the strategy. There have been a number of initiatives that have come up that really reflect how people are trying to make sure that this united front idea that really Malcolm talked about with the establishment of the OAU, and if we're really talking about that, recognizing that the organizations and the people that were part of the founding of that particular formation came out of a whole history of work that people were doing that were advancing a Black liberation struggle, a Black liberation agenda. That's happening today. The fact that we have this movement now that is intentionally tapping into unions, intentionally tapping into journalists, intentionally making connections overseas, this is a part of what we know Malcolm's legacy speaks to. My existence, if I'm being honest, comes out of that. I come out of a formation that my parents helped to establish called the East, out of central Brooklyn. I mean, aside from the huge Malcolm mural that was on the wall, but the vision, again, and principles of Malcolm's teaching were very much alive in the establishment and the programs of the East. The East helped establish one of the first Black contemporary educational institutions, independent educational institutions that was not religious, because there were a few others that existed, but they were coming out of either masjids or churches. And that school was Uhuru Sasa Shule. That was the first school I had gone to since birth, and went to that school until I was 9 years old. African-centered freedom school. Established a food co-op. Yes, a food co-op in central Brooklyn. Most people are familiar with the Park Slope Food Co-op and some of these other ones. We're talking about a food co-op in 1974, established in central Brooklyn, right? A newspaper called Black News. If all of this sounds familiar, again, because these are the things that Malcolm taught us through the principle of self-determination. The international work. We had connections and began to do work internationally in Guyana, in Tanzania, in Grenada, right? We had a vision around establishing an electoral strategy. All of these things were a reflection of what Malcolm taught us about the best of being strategic in how we're moving our work. So when we talk about the legacy, as I live and breathe, that comes through. And we move in a way that we try to make sure that we honor that legacy, that we function with the manner of integrity, with the principles that guide this. And so again, I say that it's important that we make sure that we don't get stuck on aesthetics. Because as you rightfully said, Baba Zaid, that people are looking for the leadership and trying to figure out where it is. Well, if you're looking for a Malcolm, understand the spirit of Malcolm exists, not just in the men that are there, it exists in the women that are there, it exists in the Black trans people that are there, it exists in the disabled people that are there, it exists in the homeless people that are moving. That is the leadership of today's movement. And I charge us to make sure that when we are trying to get our hands around what's outside of our doors, that we make sure that we are not putting on these blinders that will not allow us to see the leadership that exists in front of our eyes. And then lastly, some of the critiques around there not being any real spirit attached to this movement. One of the most moving things that has happened to me in 2014, as young people started to raise all kind of cane in Ferguson, I was sent by my job at that time, the Legal Defense Fund, to go out and provide support. What I witnessed in Ferguson changed me. And it allowed me to see that not only were people wrong about some of their assessments around there being a lack of spirit, they were wrong in terms of their critique around there being a lack of organization. Because number one, if not for spirit, what else would have young people standing disarmed in front of tanks? They ain't high, they not on drugs, they're very much sober. If not for spirit, what else gives them that fearlessness, that commitment to not only survive that one day in front of the militarized police force, in front of the military, but to come back day in and day out for a year? If not spirit, what is that? What is that? And if you're looking for a Christian expression of that, there was that too. If you're looking for Muslim expression, there was that too. If you're looking for Yoruba, there was that too. But I really challenge us to try to remove the framing that we're used to seeing. We're in a different time. I want us to look at the principles and not get stuck on the aesthetics. We have a cadre of young people who are hungry, who are committed, who are courageous, Many of them are interested and hungry to learn about the previous movements. Many of them were thrown into this because of this really organic desire to simply be free. They didn't study movement in college. Many of them lost their jobs because they were employed, but they said, I gotta do something. And if we're really honest with ourselves, what we see outside of our doors is the prayers being answered. because we asked for our people to rise up. We asked for our people to hit in the streets in large numbers. We asked for our people to become engaged. Well, we got it. The question is for those of us who obey those prayers, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to be supportive of it? Or are we going to continue to hate from the sidelines? Are we going to continue to throw all kinds of just uncomfortable and unnecessary things? The prayers that we ask for are being answered. I want us to make sure we recognize the blessing of this movement that exists right now in front of us. And we have a responsibility to make sure that those principles of Malcolm, the principles of so many other leaders, so many other movements that come out of that are continuously moving through this work. And so thank you all for allowing me just to get that off my chest. But I want to dig in a little further. So Kimmy, after you.
Wonderful.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I just, I guess to talk about, I guess where my perspective on this is, I guess my grandmother that a couple people have referred to, Yuri Koshiyama, she was a second generation Japanese American who was incarcerated and interned with 120,000 other American citizens during World War II. And she later became a civil rights activist and a community activist. And eventually, after encountering Malcolm and meeting Malcolm, she became a radical international anti-imperialist. Because so many of her experiences and what she had experienced made so much sense to her in terms of what Malcolm was saying, and connecting these dots between experiences of people of color in the world under imperialism. So my father was a Black Panther, my stepfather was a Black Panther, my grandmother was a radical anti-imperialist. So I grew up in this environment, much like Lumumba, where, around organizations like NAPO and RNA and, a lot of Black nationalist organizations, where, these ideas of knowing your history, of knowing the history of others, of solidarity, and particularly radical solidarity among third world people was a center, as a critical part of my education and my upbringing, and I think has impacted me in many ways. I think what's so interesting is now I work at a school, Manhattan Country School, which is a school that was founded in response to Brown v. Board. It's a school with civil rights and social justice at its core. That work is really about multicultural community building and sort of changing the world, right? By educating children in this purposefully diverse background, environment with teachers and administrators that are people of color, right? As well. I'm also co-directing the Yuri Koshiyama Archives Project with my aunt. And as part of that, we are working with multiple organizations and education projects that are so exciting in being able to bring that solidarity work that happens. So the work that Yuri did over time, connecting to so many different movements, bringing that to young people now who are really hungry for this information. So many scholars, young students, teachers at universities are so interested in making this connection now and getting access to an archive, to this archive. So I'm in terms of the networks and communities sort of coming together through this work, it's so important. And I'm in the middle of that, watching that happen. I'm also, as many people have said, been witness to, there's so many really powerful solidarity movements happening right now, just in response to everything that's happening. But I also think like this anti-Asian violence, the anti-Asian, hate crimes happening right now is such an incredibly interesting moment. It speaks to the power of imperialism, right? And of the exportation of anti-Blackness very successfully. Also, within the United States, the pervasive stereotypes around Asian Americans and who Asians are, right? And what their history is in this country, right? And I think that I've been involved with so many Black Asian solidarity events and education workshops and stuff in the last couple of months. It's been really amazing to see how Malcolm is at the center of that. and Malcolm's teachings are at the center of that. And not just my grandmother, but people understanding people like Malcolm were making those connections. And I think that that's so critically important, that these ideas of self-determination, self-defense, solidarity, knowing your history are at the center of those movements now, right? That is what people are talking about, and it's incredibly powerful. And as Lumumba said, you know, I'm watching people who are not intellectuals, who didn't grow up with the kind of political education I did, who are just making these connections now in really important and practical ways. I was on in an event a couple of weeks ago called Siblings in Solidarity, and it was Black and Asian women, young Black and Asian women coming together around this. And there was a piece of it where they had some young Black and Asian trans sex workers talking about, you know, the connections that they're making around, you know, their own oppressions and different ways that they're exploited and what's happening to them. And it was so powerful, you know, and Malcolm came up in that conversation. And, you know, and I'm just, you know, it feels like we are reaching a point that people are making some really critical connections around their experiences of oppression, right? And really understanding, you know, what the broader issues are. I think it's, you know, we can see how powerful and important that work is for the movement for Black Lives, for Black Lives Matter, for solidarity movements right now. And it feels like Malcolm's ideas and legacy is more important now and relevant than ever before.
Ilyasa, I think one of the things that resonates for me with this session, this gathering, is the whole intergenerational aspects. Lumumba touched on it with the whole BLM. You know, for me, the BLMs need to come together: the Black Liberation Movement and the Black Lives Matter. Bring them together. Have the elders who have, some of them had tremendous experience, you know, on the front line, been against the current for so many years, and need to have their stories told. I still feel that, you know, a definitive assessment and analysis of the 1960s from a Black perspective, you still got to get that together. The strengths and weaknesses, a good dialectical look at that. Ilyasa, you want to comment on what you've heard so far? How do you feel about this?
No, I'm taking it all in. I'm taking it all in. The panel has been specifically assembled for everyone to hear from each of these dynamic soldiers. And so I'm taking it in also. But thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you to each of you, of course. I'm taking notes, as I'm sure many others are.
Sure. Well, Baba, you kind of started this off. You want to pick it up and bring it a little bit further in terms of what you've heard coming from the other speakers, from Robin, from Kimi, from Lumumba?
You know, if
Go ahead,
I
Baba.
will,
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
sorry, if I will, just this is something
Go
that
ahead,
can
Ilyasa. Mm-hmm.
that will get you started, right? And this is one of the something that was taken from my father's presentation when he was delivering the OAAU.
Mm-hmm.
He said, the Black musician,
Mm-hmm.
he picks up his horn and starts blowing some sounds that he never thought of before. He improvises, he creates it. It comes from within. It's his soul. It's that soul music. It's the only area on the American scene where the Black man has been free to create, and he has mastered it. He has shown that he can come up with something nobody ever thought of on his horn. Well, likewise, he can do the same thing if given intellectual independence. He can come up with a new philosophy. He can invent a society, a social system that is different from anything that exists or has ever existed. I think that's just so powerful, because there are no restrictions and no limitations with the person and their instrument, right? And so if we can take ourselves out of that box, right, that psychological brainwash, if we can take ourselves out of that box, look at all the things that we're able to accomplish. And as many of you said, that's what happened during this march, protest, and demonstration this past summer, when our young people were politicized.
Emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. Improvisation. That's a very significant word there, improvisation, like self-determination. Huh, Robin, your impressions?
That was powerful. Thank you so much for reminding us about the power of imagination. In so many ways, I think that when we imagine the future, we automatically reproduce the scripts of the present or try to redo the past, right? But there really is so much freedom in terms of thinking about moving into a future differently, right? Moving into a future differently. So I really took that away from that comment, right? The idea of being free to create. And to take that freedom. We mentioned Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is incarcerated, you know, struggling in so many ways, but also incredibly free in terms of how he's thinking about the world, the writing that he does, the connections that he makes, the way that he thinks about the world in terms of moving beyond these borders and boundaries that artificially separate us, even the languages that separate us as well. So thinking about that seemed really, really important. So I think that's a powerful connection. And something else that had come to mind is thinking about, like, in terms of Afro-Asian solidarity. Of course, Malcolm X was operating in the context of the US war in Vietnam, right? And he took a stance on that many times in his writings, in his speeches, in many different ways. So it's also, I think, important to remember the globe, right? The events of last summer, the uprising, right, was international. And it wasn't international in the sense of solidarity, what was happening here. It provided a platform where people could elevate the longstanding struggles that they had been undergoing in their particular part of the world while operating in solidarity with the movement here. So the possibilities, I think, for that imagination requires the shifting beyond borders and boundaries. And that is so important, so important, I think, at this moment where there is oftentimes an imperative and a push to keep your head down and become hyper local, right? We can think locally and we can move globally, and those things don't have to be in contradiction.
Papa?
Yeah, I echo her sentiments. Quiet as it's kept, one of the places that Malcolm was getting ready to go to, had February 21st played out differently, was to a global Afro-Asian summit that People's Republic of China was hosting, right? So there's a reason why what happened on the 21st, why that date was selected, to prevent that continuing solidarity at that level from happening, right? Akemi's grandmother was a picture of Afro-Asian solidarity, and a tremendous personal embodiment of that. And Akemi, I must say that your grandmother had a notoriety and on her own as an anti-nuclear activist before she joined the OAAU. She came into the OAAU armed, right, with some serious stuff, right? So, I mean, so the question of international solidarity is as important as ever. And it also has this challenge. We need to be clear about this also, right? During his period was more of an anti-colonial period, right? After that, now we've got a neo-colonial Southern Hemisphere that we got to struggle with, right? So the fight for radical democracy and radical expressions of of economic ownership, i.e. slow socialism, however you want to define it, and every person's have the right to define it themselves, we have to deconstruct that backwards tendency that's holding us back that looks like us too, right? So the question of class struggle, right? The difference between the field slave and the house slave is as germane to this moment as it ever was. We need to also be very clear about that. And that's the man who gave us the guidelines how to deal with that.
Akemi?
I think I'm not sure if I have something more. I think people have really hit on the really important things. I think it's just really important, as Lumumba said, and a number of people have said, there's so many young people really doing really good work right now, right? And making connections in really good ways. And as Baba Zaid said, really making sure people have the support and the historical context and the organizational strategy, right? To do that work, I think is so critical now. And that's why I think the Shabazz Center is so critical right now also, right? For offering that historical context, for being a space for that, right? And collecting that and keeping a space for that international and multicultural community building to really keep happening. Because as I think a number of people have said, it is so powerful and it's so dangerous, right, to the powers that be, right, which is why they work so hard to take that apart. And I think that that's a really critical thing that we need to keep doing.
Lumumba?
Yeah, ditto to everything that's been shared. I do want to lift up a few things because I think it deserves some other further interrogation. The piece that you shared, Elias, I think is extremely important to inform a lot about not just this idea of imagination and creativity, but actually how it plays out. Imagination and creativity in what? Our vision of our liberation oftentimes is limited because we don't infuse any kind of imagination and creativity into it, right? One of the most rewarding things that I do, I teach a community organizing class at CUNY. And one of the most rewarding things I do is actually have my students take time to think about and reframe not just what our movement should look like based on what we're opposed to, but what it should look like based on what our vision is. And when you have people begin to think about, well, what does it look like? This is how we end up with things like a defund campaign. It didn't just fall out of the sky. It wasn't because it was catchy. It was because people recognized that we have to imagine a total different reality, that we cannot continue to function in a police state that we dress up in different ways with a black cop uniform here, playing chess over here, football here, barbecue. No, we actually need to be able to reimagine what safety looks like. And when we talk about what that looks like, we're talking about having healthy, holistically healthy communities that are self-determined. And that's what we're struggling for. We're talking about that on the institutional level. We want to see that enacted in many different ways. And so we really are recognizing that our task is multifold, but when we begin to really infuse creativity and imagination, it helps. And it helps to really dismantle one of the biggest misnomers that for generations has been a huge roadblock for us doing police brutality work. And that is this belief that police keep us safe. Our grandparents believed it, their parents believed it, our parents believed it, and it's a huge problem because when we really ask ourselves and think about what keeps us safe, it's sure ain't police, it's community, it's healthy communities. And when you really interrogate what safety looks like in different communities across the world, it's not policed communities, it's resourced communities. People that have homes, people that have their human rights needs met, they're clothed, they're employed, they're educated, they're healthy, their mental health is intact, all of those things. That's what keeps us safe. That is where our energy and efforts need to go towards. And so when we really begin to recognize the need for our political strategies to be integrated and infused with imagination and creativity, we're cooking with gas.
Baba Herb, can I jump in on that?
Go ahead, Baba.
Just several things. One, right, we can't let Elias sharing of that passage without acknowledging that Malcolm, and along with a gentleman by the name of John Coltrane, were the fathers of the Black Arts Movement.
There you go.
Right? And they started the Black Arts Movement, the spiritual sister of the Black Power / Black Liberation Movement. And I have my own handle on that coming out of Jersey up under Amiri Baraka. And I want everybody, as an organizing matter, right, to look forward as a unifying opportunity, right? Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the Gary Convention, right? And then, of course, Amiri, who picked up Malcolm's line and applied that culturally and politically in Newark, and made Newark an epicenter for Black power and Black liberation using Malcolm's line. That's the thing that I was mad about with our folks we did Who Killed Malcolm, because they cut that out. Because I was trying to give them stories on how Malcolm empowered us, right? Even after losing him, right? And they missed that opportunity. But under the leadership of Mayor Ras Baraka, another child of struggle, right? We're going to host an international convention to honor the 50th anniversary of Gary, that effort to try and build that united front. So I want folks to look forward to that, right? Because it's a practical place to go. It's a practical place for all of us to go, right? No matter the issue. And in the end, we're fighting to change our condition. That's what Lumumba's talking about. We're not just fighting for laws and policy change, but we're fighting for the things to change our conditions so we want to live. Yeah, some of us are willing to die for some of this, but we're fighting to live and to live better and to live free.
Yes.
Baba, you know, there's a dictum that says that we have the obligation, responsibility, not only to interpret, but to change in terms of culture and politics. Frank Kopsky put out a book many years ago that was germane to what you're talking about in terms of the cultural politics coming together through the lens of John Coltrane and Malcolm X. I caught John Coltrane several times at the Minor Key in Detroit, helped present him there, right down front. My head was in the bell of his horn. Spit was flying all over me. I never wiped any of it off. He reminded me so much. And this kind of exuberance, this kind of spiritual pursuit, that probing beyond the harmonic contours of the book, beyond the melodic inventions, beyond Charlie Parker, you know, taking it almost in a cosmic sense. That's where Train was headed. I think that Malcolm, for me, this visionary that he was taken from us pretty much at one of the major plateaus of his development, political development. It was just 1964 was the most remarkable, and a little bit of 65 too. But that year, 64, was transformative. I mean, it hit me. I was in the military at that point, but I was still feeling the impact of Malcolm's ideas, his kind of vision and perspective. I came out of the service with the intention of joining him again in New York City. He was scheduled to come to Detroit February the 14th. I was working at Dodge, Maine, General Baker. We heard on the news that the house 2311, 97th Street, East Elmhurst, had been firebombed. That Malcolm had got out with his family, luckily. We heard about that, and two or three of us made our minds, well, hey, he's not going to be coming to fulfill his obligation to speak at Ford Auditorium. I was working on the graveyard shift. I went to work. I regret that moment because Malcolm kept his word. His house is hit 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock, he's on a plane, hits Detroit, Milton Henry, the Afro-American Broadcasting Company. Milton was very close, the whole Henry family. You know, Brother Gaidi of the whole Republic of New Africa. I mean, we had some people in Detroit who was just linked to Malcolm in such a strong and intimate way. At some point, we're going to have to find some kind of way to bring Harlem and Detroit together.
Yes, sir.
Let's work on that, gang. Okay?
Yes, sir.
I
I
don't know,
wanted
we
to,
got any calls coming in, chat, so we want to do Ilyasa or
I
Naja?
wanted to quickly make a point
Go ahead,
about,
Robin.
oh, sorry, I just wanted to quickly make a point before we open it up. I'm sure
Go ahead,
that the
Robin.
audience is ready to engage the conversation further. But Ilyasa started us off with this call to action about building power and building relationships. And I wanted to highlight how deeply political building relationships are. When I found out about Yuri Kochiyama through the letters that she sent to people, literally sometimes it would be a form letter, dear blank, and she would write in your name and you would get, and she put a personal note at the bottom, just sharing political information. She did this with, had to be hundreds of people. So I'm really excited to find out that this archival project exists. Building relationships is so key to what we do. And people sometimes demystify what is organizing, what does it mean to be an organizer, build relationships, and unpack power, right? And move collectively. Like those are some of the elements of what it takes. And it's so important because I think oftentimes we exist in these spaces and this moment in history has sent us into these Zoom boxes where we can't touch or see each other, right? Or even, you know, or anything like that. So it's important to think about how important it is to build relationships as part of a political project and the growth that Malcolm X experienced throughout his life, right? He was not a static person. Sometimes people seek to become politically aware and then freeze themselves in that moment or stand in that, you know, that power that they feel. But Malcolm was always on the move and embracing, you know, difference and different ideas and concepts while remaining true to his core. So I think I wanted just to highlight that because I felt so important when we think about archives, writing letters as political organizing, as relationship building, keeping up with people, especially in this time of global plague and, you know, twin, triple pandemics going on. How are we maintaining our relationships with each other? Relationships of integrity, relationships of love, right? Relationships of struggle.
Very good,
You know, I
Robin.
know that Herb Boyd, I know that you actually met my father, right?
Sure.
And so I would imagine that most people would want to know, what was it about Malcolm that drew you to him? And were you changed after you met him?
Interesting. Uh, you know, one of the things about, oh, I met Malcolm the first time, and sometimes the memory is tricky in terms of the 1959, 1960, somewhere around in there. He, by that time, he was the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, right? He's traveling around. Anytime he came to Detroit, it was a massive turnout for him at the mosque, at the temple. Temple number one, people have to understand, you know this history very well, Ilyas, and many of the panelists too, that the Nation of Islam started in Detroit, a part of Detroit called Black Bottom, near Paradise Valley. Elijah Muhammad and Farad Muhammad. One of the things they don't know is that it was a black woman, Bernstein Sharif Muhammad, the wife of John Muhammad, who was the brother of Elijah, who was the real brain trust. She had the education background. She had gone to Commerce High School in Detroit, one of the leading high schools at that time, like a sister academy to Cass Tech, which was one of the leading high schools there. All of these great musicians, Ron Carter, Jerry Allen, you know, all came out of Cass Tech High School. But she put together the University of Islam. It was her idea. She took whatever Fard Muhammad gave her, she had to translate it and sometimes even transform it and transpose it and make it, you know, really concrete. So that black woman, here she is at the heartbeat of this organization. So I had the kind of background because I lived in Black Bottom. So the whole connection to when the nation began to develop, you know, I had a couple of cousins. One of my cousins became like a key member of the nation. His name was Jack Boyd. He knew Arabic, I mean, as well as anyone. He was a student with me at Wayne State University, Bashir. Bashir, he's dead now. But he was the one who began to encourage me to come to the mosque and hear Malcolm. Hearing him the first time, it was like mesmerized. I was mesmerized. I mean, he had the blackboard up there, Ilyasa, and he would write things on the blackboard, and I would be taking my notes. I wasn't a journalist yet, unfortunately, because after he spoke, Malcolm would have all of us line up in the hallway, and he'd walk down and shake our hands, and we had a chance to greet him. The journalist in me was not alive. Matter of fact, I was absolutely intimidated. When he grabbed my hand, I never felt a hand that big. I've seen, look here, when I taught at Oberlin College, at the conservatory there, they had an exhibit one time of Wilt Chamberlain's hand and the jockey Eddie Arcaro, just to show you the contrast. I looked at that thing, I said, that's Malcolm's hand right there. Tremendous hand, a tremendous grip. I felt his warmth. And from that moment on, he had me. And then I made it my business each time he came. Matter of fact, I had filled out my application to become a member of the Nation of Islam, but the army beat them to me. The army grabbed me off. But all through my military days, you know, Malcolm was on my mind and he stayed right there. Meeting him left an indelible impression. When he was assassinated, I was prepared to have a Greyhound bus ticket after he'd come to Detroit. He did that, you know, with all his family endangered and everything. I'm going back to New York, hook up with Peter Bailey and write with the Black Lash. That was my dream. When he was taken from me, I remember when he used to talk about education. I would say, because I hadn't been to university yet, I dropped everything. I didn't want to come to the funeral. I went to Wayne State University. I stayed around there 15 years. I was a part of the whole Black Studies movement. We talked about that a little bit the other night, Baba. You know, we were talking about what happened with at San Francisco State, what was that, Temple University, Cornell, down at Howard University, which what have you. So I said, okay, how can I honor Malcolm? I said, get yourself an education, brother. So I took myself down to Wayne State University. In 2 years, Detroit exploded. Robin knows this. Detroit exploded into a rebellion. I'm at Wayne State University, a part of the students there, a little bit more advanced than the other students. I'm 26 years old. You know, they're still wet behind the ears. I done traveled all over the world. I've been with Malcolm. I read everything, the Baldwins, the Richard Wright, the Ralph Ellison, all of the books. So when we finally took over the academy behind the rebellion, they were so fearful that we were going to bring the rebellion on campus. They gave us everything we wanted. We began to demand Black studies. We got what we wanted, and they put me in a situation to teach the class. The first class I taught in starting Black studies at Wayne State University was using the autobiography of Malcolm X. That was my text, and it continues to be my text right now as I teach at City College. And I hope my students are joining us because they've been asking for you to come. So we have to talk about that. Thank you, Ilyasa.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Professor Boyd. There's a question here. If Malcolm was here with us today, do you think the fight would be the same? And I would imagine that each of you has a different perspective and reply. Let's start with you, Baba Zaid Muhammad. Do you think?
First, let me just say this. I don't, historians don't like to speculate, right? But I'll say this. One of the most important things that is also underappreciated about your father's legacy is that unlike a whole lot of these commercial leaders that we got today, and I'm not going to bite my tongue, he is not afraid of our youth. From the lowest rungs of the street that he came from, right? I stole autobiography in a drug transaction. That kept me from going to prison, right? From the lowest ranks to debates and Oxford University, at the top of the world. Malcolm was always engaging young people and believed in their capacity to contribute in an original way, right? And one of the most demonstrable expressions of that was his relationship with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with SNCC. We did a whole session on that back in October, right? Merit study, right? When I do my 60s lectures, Barbara Herb, I say, Black youth went into the 1960s, children of Martin Luther King, but came out children of Malcolm X. And that was the vortex for which that happened. Of course, upon his assassination, those are young people. Amiri Baraka was a young man, right? Y'all were young. Max Stanford, all those brothers and sisters that made up all the new African independence movement, those are young folks, right? Taking it personal. Those young folks that were on the range with Herman Ferguson, okay? And went into the Black Panther Party. They were young. And they took it up and they made a difference. And they all, in their original ways, picked up on what they understood they needed to get from Malcolm. And our children deserve the opportunity to do that now also. And we need to get out of their way if we can't help them.
That's right. Very, very good. And that is the whole purpose of having this intergenerational dialogue and the whole reason why we still need to have this intergenerational movement. Who else has, is there someone else that'd like to contribute to that?
I'll jump in, even though, you know, I'm not a official historian, but I do I guess I'm not comfortable with answering those questions on what if somebody was still alive, because you just don't know, right? Conditions, all things, so much. However, I will say, just based on some of what we do know about our Black Shining Prince, what we do know about how he functioned in terms of making space for room for people to grow. One of the things I always say is that Malcolm had sort of exemplified restorative justice practices before we even had a title for it, before we even had language around what it was. This whole idea of recognizing that you are not the worst that you've ever done, that we make space for people to grow, we make space for people to continue to evolve, right? I will say that the idea of having uncompromising beliefs around and positions around our liberation is something that would be far more advanced right now. Even though we're seeing it now, I do want to, say, and it's hard to say because I think his assassination sparked up a whole nother level of resistance that, the question is, would that have existed, had he not been martyred? That's a good question. I don't know. We can speculate.
Right.
We can certainly speculate. We do know that his assassination caused a whole nother level of organizers and activists to hit the streets and take our liberation movement to another level. So we really don't know. Excuse me. We really don't know. However, I think some of the best pieces of what he has to offer around internationalism, being connected to specifically liberation movements on the continent, making sure that we're connecting ourselves to working forces in the country. Absolutely, I think we'd be in a much different place, much better place.
Yeah, and he did say that it would be this generation that would rise up, that they would recognize that those who are in power have misused it, and that they would demand change, and that they'd be willing to roll up their sleeves and do the necessary work.
That's right.
So there's another question here.
There's the most important thing Malcolm taught us.
I wanted to get to this one question. What do you think he would have, that's another one of those, what would Malcolm have thought? Well, yes. I'll say the question and we'll move to something else. What do you think he would have thought about the Black Lives Matter movement? What would he have thought about that? I mean, I think, anyone, Dr. Spencer?
With Robin.
Well, I think if you look at Malcolm's history and the way that he was a supporter of the grassroots, of organizing, of speaking truth to power, of being uncompromising in your beliefs, and using clear and plain language to name your oppression and to confront your oppressors, the fluidity that he had around his ideas, the global and nationwide scope, I think those are the elements in Black Lives Matter that would have resonated, I think, with him and his legacy. And I think it's just so important to make these connections. Important to recognize that Malcolm X did leave behind an institutional legacy, right? Through the organizations that he helped to found, as well as through the ongoing work of Dr. Betty Shabazz and what she did to continue his work in his absence. So that's what I would say.
That's great. Sister Kochiyama, would you like to add anything to that?
I guess maybe just to tag on to this idea about the question about Black Lives Matter, I think in terms, someone mentioned before principles, right? This idea of principles. And I think so many of the principles of Black Lives Matter and some of these movements now include some of the principles that Malcolm was really talking about, right? In terms of, rights to education, rights to safety and security, really upholding and promoting the Black family, culture, history, pride, right? All of that was, to me, those are principles that Malcolm talked about that are still part of the principles of Black Lives Matter. So a couple of things, of course, clearly they haven't been addressed enough, right? Those are still challenges and struggles. But I do think that, some of those ideas are, still there within the Black Lives Matter principles.
Excellent. Now this next question is a little tricky, so listen closely. Can each of you speak more about the construction of movement leadership today, it being more by committee, not necessarily about an individual or personality? Baba, Muhammad, you want to start?
Yeah, oh yeah, and I alluded to it already, right? One of the things that, and unfortunately, folks within the OAAU struggled with it and didn't recognize, they didn't have the vision that he had. But when he went abroad, he left the organization's leadership to a woman by the name of Lynn Shiflett. A lot of folks don't know that, right? Okay. And also he raised that whole question of beginning to look at doing things collectively and making decisions collectively, right? And that was the relationship and the influence that he had on SNCC was not one way. He was paying attention to what they were doing too. And that dynamic of collective leadership, they got that from the great Ella Baker, right? So that energy was there. He was in his fluidity, using Robert's language, he was embracing where we needed to go. And let's look at, some other nations that bang for their liberation and protect their liberation. When they're making their moves, it's not any one leader. You're dealing with a people, and that's a place of maturity, a political and military maturity. I said military maturity that we need to get to. We cannot stay stuck in that messianic, individualistic leadership mode. That mode is limited. It can be co-opted. We got a history full of that. We're in a moment where we got leadership that's co-opted and just full of that mess. And of course, we can lose them the way we lost your father on February 21st, 65, right? And had the organization had a little more time to embrace where he was trying to go, it probably would have gone on to another level, even in his absence. And that's what he was really hoping would have happened.
If I can jump in here really quickly, I think that's part of what I was alluding to earlier in terms of making sure that when we're looking at this movement, we're looking at the movement with a critical lens, not stuck on aesthetics. We're actually looking at principles, because I belong to the Malcolm X grassroots movement. If you ask somebody who is the leader of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, you will not get an answer, because there is no leader, right? We have a collective leadership model. I come out of the movement for Black Lives. Who's the leader of the movement for Black Lives? You don't have a leader. We have a collection of leaders, and that's intentional. But I think so it's twofold. One, those who are coming into this space of organizing now need to be real clear about the strategic necessity of collective leadership models, absolutely. But also people who are not necessarily that engaged need to recognize that you got to stop looking for that one person. Because what happens is we have, especially with the advent of technology now, people who are very influential, who are charismatic, who have a few 100,000 leaders, followers on this thing, all of a sudden now consider themselves to be leaders. That ain't how we roll. And oftentimes they become a challenge to what real organized grassroots movements are trying to do. And we got somebody who's real popular throwing a wrench in the program. So we really trying to be real clear about what leadership actually is, looks like, and the different creative ways that those models can exist.
Wow, that's really great. And I think a lot of young people want to hear that the organization should be a collection of leaders and not necessarily many going and then looking around and wondering who's going to lead us, but that we all bring something to the table, each one of us. That's really important. Would anyone else like to jump in and answer that question before I move on to the last two questions?
Well, I want to quickly, oh, sorry. Okay, well, I just want to quickly say that it's important to know, I mean, the models of leadership in this period and the role of people like Ella Baker, strong people don't need strong leaders, Queen Mother Moore, people who understood that leading was also teaching, that leading was not a monopoly of skills, such that the best spokesperson became the spokesperson, but a leader would teach so that many people would, that skill would multiply within the leadership cadre of any particular organization. So thinking about that is really important, I think, because it's one thing to sort of, I think that really gets to the human condition, people coming into movements and feeling like, what do I have to give? How can I contribute? And to understand that we have to operate on all levels. That might mean the best speaker might be the person doing clerical work, and the person doing clerical work can also go and interact with the press or do a release or something like that. It's about thinking differently about human potential and the idea of being in movement as a way of developing the self, the collective, the community to change the world. That's what it takes. That's what allows us to pierce through ego, pierce through only me, or I can do it, or I'm the best one, or I'm, indispensable, to thinking about how to create situations where no one is indispensable, where a movement can last and go beyond the removal of their leaders, especially given the fact that as people of African descent in the US, we are operating in hostile territory, right? So our leaders, anyone who takes on the mantle of leadership, is already doubly marked.
It's absolutely true. The whole notion of a hydra-headed leadership was discussed during the 60s because we recognized the danger of just having one person out there. We saw too many assassinations that stifled organizations. And one of the things I want to say about where Malcolm would be now, we still try to catch up with where Malcolm was. He left us at a point of development that we haven't arrived yet. I mean, he was an organic, systematic thinker, visionary. So I must say he was leagues out in front in understanding, particularly from an international perspective. What he was trying to do early on, Baba, you was talking about, Paul Robeson, but then William Patterson, we charged genocide. Malcolm picked up on the energy of that. The World Court taking this US, you'll say, come on, the criminal nation, they need to be charged with these crimes of humanity. That's what Malcolm was trying to say. I mean, they didn't let him speak at the summit in Cairo, but he did share that paper he pulled together thanks to David Du Bois, who was there in Egypt with him and helped him pull that paper together that was circulated with all these leaders. But he recognized, and one of the things that Ilyas and I discovered is that the CIA was dead on his trail. The FBI cut him loose at some point when he left the shores of US. The CIA picked him up at that point. And we have too many indications of that. It's a project I'm working on right now and hope that I could bring some clarity to that situation and what was really happening with the surveillance he was under, the whole poisoning situation. All of these things have to be discussed. Milton Henry, I had a chance to spend time with him in Detroit. He gave me a lot of inside information. It's a shame that when he died, the family destroyed a lot of the papers he had gathered. that was a terrible setback for a number of us activists in the community who was a part of a forming and forging a tribunal, which we did after rebellion in Detroit. But a whole lot of things, was sabotaged along the way. Leadership we lost, the kind of analysis that would improve our situation where we are right now. But the point is, Oyasa, a collective leadership, hydra-headed leadership, all of that's significant. And understand where Malcolm was when he left us. Let's get to that level of analysis, that level of systematic, or as Dr. Jeffers used to say, we got to have a systems analysis. Right, Baba?
Thank you for that, Professor Boyd. It made me think about when we're talking about this collective leadership, the importance that my mother placed on self-love in our household. And, it wasn't until I got older that I realized that she made sure that we grew up with a really strong sense of our identity by learning about people of first world nations, by learning about people of Islam, by learning about women, the African diaspora and so forth, so that we grew up loving ourselves so much that when we saw you as a reflection of us, that we loved you. And, if we had a better sense of this self-love and history and appreciation and self-respect, then it's easier for us to come together as leaders and be a lot more productive and progressive and accomplish these goals. Because when we think about it, there are 8,600,000,000 people in the world, and 80% are people of color. And I know my father used to say, how can such a small percentage control, right? So how do we hold our community leaders and community organizations accountable to the standard of intersectional and international solidarity and of an effective unpacking of power by Malcolm? That sounds like a question that Naja put together because it's very layered. She's got this serious mind. Can anyone answer that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that part of what, and this is somewhat of the science of organizing, when we commit ourselves to engaging in this work, we're doing it not to reflect our individual desires, but we're actually representing people. We're representing groups of people. We're representing our communities. And if we don't have a process to make sure that the work that we're doing is a reflection of what our communities actually want, then we are totally detached from that. So this whole idea of accountability should be really a part of what our organizational structures and models look like. Because what you want to avoid in an organization is being out there in isolation, functioning, thinking you're doing something in the interest of your people, and there's somewhere else like talking, I don't know what the hell they doing, right? But also a part of what makes that an organic process is the community should be your organization. Like the people should be your organizers. That's what we're talking about, not necessarily some other folks from outside other different places. When we organize in the Malcolm X grassroots, when we're talking about we're representing Central Brooklyn, it's because we're representing the people who live in the areas that we live in, my neighbors, right? I used to teach at Medgar Evers College, my students. That's really what we're talking about. It's really, and it's not, rocket science, quite honestly, but it is, again, something that should be really a part of what your organizational structure looks like. There are places and people who actually intentionally make sure that does not exist so that they can really advance their own personal agenda. So we need to be really clear and pay attention to some of those things as well.
Yes, I just to add to that, I guess, and some of the ways, I think some people have already spoken to this on the panel, but I think building relationships, continuing to just relationships is really critical. As I think Dr. Spencer said, and a couple of people have already said, I think just continuing to make those connections, on a community level, in various organizations and communities and networks that you find yourself. I think that you just have to keep doing that work. But I also want to just say the importance of archiving. Dr. Boyd just spoke to, what happens when you lose history and information and archives. I'm in the midst of an archive project right now that is so useful, and multiple, I'm aware of multiple archiving projects which are really helping to create this history and this connection between organizations. And I think, with digitization, with technology, we could be much smarter about collectively sharing our archives. And I know that there are organizations that are doing that work right now and reaching out to organizations, Black Women Radicals, a number of organizations are doing that work. And I just want to say it's already happening, but it should be happening, as much as possible. And that's the work that we can do within the organizations that we're involved in to make sure that we are documenting our own histories, but also digitizing them, sharing them with other organizations. Wow.
When you speak, I can't help but to think about your grandmother, Yuri Koshiyama. And I think, Professor Boyd, I missed your opening. You mentioned this brilliant work and this committed activist, this humanitarian who was so close to my father, and what she did when she was there on February 21st, 1965. Can you just share that again with us, please?
There's a photo. Matter of fact, there's more than one photo. And Yuri has your father's head in her lap. Gene Roberts, one of the undercover cops, and I interviewed him several times, made him walk through the Autobahn and point out different things and everything with a photographer, Jules Allen. We did that for Class magazine, which no longer exists. But I had a long conversation with Gene, and I see him in some of the photos too, leaning over your father. He talked about the mouth-to-mouth, the resuscitation. Yuri is right there. And I talked to Yuri about that moment, how she felt about it. She says, well, what could you do? It was just a helpless situation. He was hoping that they're right across the street from the hospital. You hope they'd hurry up and get somebody on over. They finally got a gurney over there, but it was much too slow, much too late. But that was a lasting impression with Yuri. And I had Yuri talk about a number of things, her own coming of activism, even with her husband, at that time, and maybe, Akimi, you could talk about your grandfather, You talk about Yuri, but what about your grandfather?
No, I would just say, they both had incredible lives, but some people don't know, my grandfather was actually raised on 126th Street and was raised in an orphanage on 126th Street, Sheltering Arms. It's now a swimming pool, it's still there, a public swimming pool, across the street from Manhattanville Projects. So, he lived there his whole life and then got interned and then, decided to join the 442 rather than stay in, Alkali Desert, as he described it, in Topaz. He decided to join the military service to prove his loyalty and to prove his patriotism to United States. And, through, a very traumatic experience of surviving and living through being in the front lines of that experience. He wasn't politicized right away, but I think, there were multiple experiences that happened to him. One, having that experience of being interned, but I think also, he trained in Hattiesburg, Mississippi in all Black, all Japanese segregated training camps. And a lot of, that was the first time he saw Jim Crow ever, having been from New York. I think that's really, it was significant to him. I think, later, I think it really had an impact on him. And ironically, that's where he met Yuri, was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So I think it's just, at that camp, Camp Shelby, I think it's interesting just to know that they had segregated Japanese USOs. So they bussed in Japanese women who were interned in camp to come and dance and hang out with Japanese soldiers who were about to ship out to Europe. So that is how my grandparents met, at USO, and just it's interesting that context, that they met in that context and then wrote to each other throughout the war, got married right afterwards, and then moved into first the Amsterdam projects in mid-Manhattan West, and then to Harlem, right, as the Manhattanville projects And they happened to come into that community right when, right before sort of all this, political activity began. And, the first thing they got involved in was the Harlem Parents Committee. So like, this conversation about, engaging in community and making connections, they literally became a part of this community because they moved into a predominantly Black and Latino community and found themselves, parents with 6 kids in public school and joined the Harlem Parents Committee. And that led to them joining the Harlem Freedom Schools. And that's how they got involved and got educated, was by coming into the Freedom Schools. I think Freedom Schools are a really important, effective way to build community. And I think that it's something, Naja, who we've all mentioned, is also involved with building Freedom Schools. I think that is something we should think about now and continue to think about now as effective ways to educate. And we talk about allies and solidarity. And one of the ways to begin to bring people into that conversation and knowing your history is through Freedom Schools. And I think it's really critical, important for people to know that my grandfather and my grandmother got educated, in that way. And they enrolled all 6 of their children in that Freedom School because they felt that if they were living in a Black community and they didn't know anything about the history of Black people, like how could they be in that community if they didn't? And I think that that's an approach that I wish more people who talk about being allies and being in solidarity would think about. And I think, it's a useful idea that's very practical, and it has everything to do with relationship building and really being in community with people.
Can I just add to that? Just very
Yes,
simple.
please.
I ran a Freedom School for 12 years in Jersey, and then I definitely unite with that. Your father was a World War II hero. Grandfather, Bill, was a World War II hero, a humble man, but he was a warrior who saw combat, right? And really battled with Nazis on the front and some frontline stuff, and that is something to truly appreciate in terms of his manhood. Right. And their home became a home of struggle. All of us met there at some point in our lives, doing something important work right out of that, your grandmother and your grandfather's apartment for years. I wanted to appreciate that. Life magazine did the spread of that epic picture, right, in centerfold of the assassination where Yuri is trying to give aid to Malcolm when Malcolm fell, right? And it's still very much around. It's still very much to appreciate it. Now, our censors in social media will try and obscure that, but it's there. The record is very clear, and so that's there to appreciate. I just wanted to put a pin into that.
Well, panel, we just have a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask our last and final question, and think in terms of that young person who's watching, who's listening, and they want to know, how can they get involved? How can they be inspired, right? What is the most important thing Malcolm taught you that you would want to pass on to this next generation? And we'll start with you, Dr. Spencer.
Mhm.
What a powerful question. It's hard to identify one thing, but the thing that comes to mind is to speak out. I think that oftentimes we are so afraid to confront with anger, righteous anger, with brilliant analysis, with, reasoned thinkings, ideologies drawn from all over the world and from our grandmothers and grandfathers. I believe that when I look at Malcolm X's speeches and I see his fiery delivery, I also see his smile, the way he used humor. I see the way that he made a personal connection, the way that he was very present in the moments of his speeches. I read his speeches and I'm amazed. I'm amazed by them, right? Because of the depth of discernment that were in his speeches. And you gave us some quotes, some quotations. Several people said it here today. So thinking about Malcolm X and speaking out, using your voice, even when it may not be the voice that anyone thinks is important because of your gender, because of your your class, because of your sexuality, because of your accent, so-called, right? Just to speak out, to continue to speak truth to power, and to continue to read and learn about Malcolm X and his legacy.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think that, okay, let's see. Professor Boyd, what is something that you would, that you learned about Malcolm that you would pass on to this next generation?
Well, that's something that I try to do each time I meet with my students. I think one of the things that he taught me also was a sense of integrity and then sincerity, honesty, to be forthright in your commitment, to study your history. He was a historian. A lot of people kind of like just fly past that. But he also was a culturologist. He was like an anthropologist. He was an ethnomusicologist. So it was a certain kind of versatility that he had that inspired me to go ahead. When I studied at Wayne State University, my first major was anthropology, because I would say Malcolm had this kind of all-consuming perspective. It was so much in there. You can pluck off what you want and run with it. Always to be strong and identify with your people, speak truth, and walk with courage. And of all our studies, history is our best reward. And that's what I've done. I've tried to be the historian he was, to be the activist, like a AAA person, you know, to be the author, the academic, and the activist. That lives up, try to live up to the model and the perspective, the vision that he possessed. That's not easy to do. Our young people got elders that they can look up to, I hope, and draw inspiration from their lives. You don't have to necessarily go running around to get anyone. It may be right in your own household. Grab onto that mother, that father, that uncle, that aunt, that big brother, that big sister. You know, they can bring that, and they have an obligation to bring that information home. I tell my students all the time, you know, you sitting here, you got an opportunity to share and exchange and learn, but you have an obligation, responsibility to take it home, because a lot of them, they don't have that same opportunity. So take advantage of where you are. You struggle where you are. Struggle where you are, Ilyasa. You have done that. Baba has done that. Robin has done it. Akima, she's on her way to doing that. Lumumba's been there for years. We are the collective we've been waiting for. Thank you.
You know, I think that's great for young people to learn as much as they possibly can, and then to bring it back home if their parents weren't afforded that opportunity, or their grandparents,
Sure.
or any elders in the community. I think that's really great. So that's wonderful. Sister Koshiyama, something that you learned about Malcolm that you would like to share and impart on this next generation?
I would say there's so many things, as Dr. Boyd and everyone else has said, there's so many things that Malcolm did so well that we could learn from. But I'd say for me personally, the most important thing I'd say is radical love. I think to do what he did, to transform himself and the sacrifices he made, I think, and it comes from a radical love. And I think that people think of Malcolm, you know, the image of him is very militant or hostile or angry, and, you know, this idea, right? But actually, if you really read him, if you look at what he was doing, his incredible humanity, I think that's the most inspiring thing to me, is his radical love.
You know, it's something that you say that. I was going to ask you if you could share with those who don't understand what radical love is, because many people think or thought that Malcolm was violent and angry, and you know, and I often say that It was his reaction, you know, and that reaction has to be from someone who has such compassion and such love and such faith, right?
I think people have already mentioned, you know, his own family history. You know, he was very educated by his own family, by his own parents, right? He had incredible pride and understanding of the power and contributions Black people have made to the United States, but, you know, in the world, right? And he had a real understanding of that. And I think he was incensed and very, you know, angry about what had, you know, what has been done, right, to Black people in the world. And I think exactly what you're saying, I think his commitment came from a real, like when you really read Malcolm, what you understand is his sense of humanity, right? Just the basic respect, integrity, safety he wanted for his people. And that came from a sense of humanity, and not just for Black people, but for all people. And I think that that's a critical sort of piece for young people to understand. Don't just like listen to stuff and don't just read the autobiography, read the speeches, as Dr. Spencer said. It's so critical to read his speeches and his writings. And that's where you get, you know, the radical love part.
That's really beautiful. Let's see, it's a toss between these last two brothers. Who's gonna go first? Baba Zaid Muhammad.
Go ahead, Baba.
There's anything I want young people to learn, I want them to know that's the importance of being able to think for themselves, right? He believed in our capacity, and I'm saying that, you know, as you know, that's that son that I wish I was of his, you know, to do that, right? To study everything. One thing I want to say too, also, because I don't want this to get missed, because I think we need to learn some lessons about how we lost them and some mistakes our community made in terms of the question of accountability with leadership. We need to stay the hell away from so-called religious, you know, leaders who could put themselves above accountability, right? We need to be real careful about that, right? Because that's what happened. That's what was exploited, and that's how we lost him, right? And so that is not the way to go. That's definitely needs to stay in the past. But to think for yourself, learn how to think for yourself, question of critical thinking, learning, studying everything, being able to synthesize that by finding out who your center is, by finding out who you are as an African person in this world, right? And walking and daring to walk with integrity and healing yourself from wherever you are in your station, right? From the lowest of the low. I mean, when he fell, streets, prison, that's a real expression where so many Black men have fallen and continue to fall, but he has given us a vehicle and example on how to wake up, clean up, and stand up and transcend that and still make a difference.
Ashe.
I'm gonna say, oh.
I had a thought that left me just as quickly as it came. When Malcolm learned, and this is one of the things I talk about in this Awakening of Malcolm X, it's a young adult book. When he studied the dictionary, he didn't study the dictionary because he didn't know how to spell or write. He studied the dictionary because everything that he did, he wanted to be fully prepared. He wanted to be his best. And he was a star debater at the prison, the colony, and they debated MIT, Harvard, Boston University. And so Malcolm studied the dictionary so he could know the etymology. He wanted to know the root words so that no one could put anything over his head, but that he was fully informed. And so we leave with you, Brother Lumumba Bendeli.
I wish I could close with just saying ditto to what everybody said, but I'll add, you know, as an organizer, one of the biggest challenges that we have is the apathy of our people. People don't believe that we can win. So I think what I would leave as an offering is, you know, Malcolm showed us to do what we can where we are with what we have. Like, we are never totally powerless. Like, we have not only just the creativity, but we have agency. We have the ability to really change things in a real meaningful way. And that helps to also just demystify this idea of what an organizer actually is, right? It's not somebody who came from this like heaven sent kind of place. These are people, I'm talking about the Fannie Lou Hamer a legacy of organizing, meaning that you are using your conditions, the validity of your experience, your lived experience to change your material conditions. And so that we have a responsibility, and when I teach my classes, that we have not only a responsibility to do this work to change our conditions, but we have equally as important the ability. That history has told us that we have the ability. And in doing so, recognizing that, and I'm probably cheating by adding an additional thing that not just one, but two, but recognizing that this is not a miraculous kind of thing. And we talk about Malcolm's ascending to this place of effectiveness, that it wasn't magic, in recognizing that we are just a blip in the trajectory of our liberation movement, but we have to be real clear about where that blip is, and recognizing that we can draw a line, that we cannot disconnect Malcolm's legacy from that of Garvey, of the UNIA. That we cannot disconnect Malcolm's legacy from that of the Black Panther Party. We cannot disconnect Malcolm's legacy from that of the current movement for Black lives. That we are doing our part to move our liberation movement forward. We are all a part of this. And that is what we have to do. We have the responsibility and we have the ability.
Wow. What a, you guys, we're so grateful. You know, I want to say that one of the things I discovered when my father was in jail in his 20s, that he was first at Charlestown, which was deplorable. It was absolutely deplorable. And then he went to the colony. And that was a rehabilitative experimental prison where it was like a college dormitory. And it was there that he read all of these books. Mm-hmm. And he discovered so much great history that he decided to go back to this deplorable prison so he could let all of the Black former inmates know that you have a history.
They can recruit.
No, because he wanted them to understand their history, that they have an identity. Because remember, we didn't know who we were. We had no idea that we were refined and industrious African citizens, that we built those pyramids, that we were the astrologists, and so forth and so on. And so just like my father left the Middle East and Africa to come back to the US, knowing that those lie in wait to destroy him, he came out of his love. And so it is our hope that all of this information that we've gained tonight in our lives, that we will share it with others, and that we can have this collective leadership, as Brother Bandelli spoke about, as Brother Muhammad, Sister Koshiyama, Sister Spencer, and Brother Boyd, as you all talked about, so that we could all come together and find these solutions that Malcolm was in search of, these solutions to the human condition that want to annihilate us, right? But that we can come together and understand our value and our worth and do the necessary work.
Yasa, let me give you the full quote, okay?
Yes.
Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. Mm-hmm. And when you see that you've got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who have problems similar to yours. And once you see how they got theirs straight, then you know how you can get yours straight. Malcolm X.
That's wonderful. Sister Naja, are you coming back on to bid us a good evening?
Naja?
I'm coming on. This is so wonderful. I've just been taking this all in. I'm grateful as a younger person, learning from my elders, heeding the call to move forward with real clarity in terms of what Malcolm X offered us. I'm grateful because this is the sort of history lesson we need to feel fortified and strengthened, that we're doing the right thing, and that this moment is powerful, that we shouldn't feel overwhelmed by the uncertainty of tomorrow, because we have so much history bolstering us and providing a really solid foundation to move forward on. So I just thank you all so much for being here, for leading this conversation, and for doing the work and exemplifying the best in our tradition. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll see you, Lumumba. See you, Robin.
See you, everyone.
Good to
Bye.
meet you,
Good night.
Akeem.
Thank you.
Bye, Robin.